Good evening. Tonight we open with something far colder than any lullaby. Cyanide, that small, pitiless shadow that has slipped through courtrooms, cellars, and the back corridors of power. Forget the glossy spy stories. No tidy glass ampules here, no perfectly delivered final lines. The real history of cyanide is harsher, more bureaucratic, and disturbingly mundane. In truth, you probably wouldn't last a single day inside the worlds where it moved unseen, where its presence meant that lives, dynasties, and governments could pivot with horrifying speed. If you're into this kind of story, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, and drop a comment telling me where you're watching from and what time it is where you are. I'm always intrigued by how many corners of the world people tune in from. Now dim the lights. Let's walk together into tonight's darker story. In a cramped Berlin dye, works at the dawn of the 18th century, a small irritation in a craftsman's routine brought forth a color the continent had never truly seen. A blue so deep and unwavering that soldiers' uniforms, painters' palettes, and porcelain glazes all soon clamored for it. The tale that chemists later liked to repeat about that blue Prussian blue had everything a good legend needs. Johann Jakob Diesbach had been working with iron, various salts, and potash when a stray ingredient or a tainted container yielded a solid that would not fade. It was less expensive than natural indigo, more intense than ultramarine, and it flooded into Europe's visual imagination almost overnight. Artists adored it, armies adopted it, merchants profited from it. As so often happens, beauty drew attention, and attention led to investigation. Beauty has consequences. The blue that softened drawing rooms and marched down military lines was also a kind of locked chest, one of chemistry's puzzles waiting for someone to open it. For decades, the pigment's true nature taunted the curious, who attacked it with acids and tormented it with heat. It was clearly not just iron oxide, nor an ordinary organic dye. It was a structure in which iron was coordinated to a carbon-nitrogen group that would later acquire a reputation all its own. The first wave of modern chemists approached the pigment as they did every new substance, by breaking it down carefully, smelling it warily, and adding here and there a touch of mischievous curiosity. From that pigment, under the surgeon's knife of laboratory acids, there distilled a volatile, thin liquid sharp to the nose, bitter like the kernel of a certain nut, and unmistakably treacherous. Carl Wilhelm Scheele, the Swedish apothecary chemist who ran a private lab first in the small town of Köping and later in Uppsala, was one of those men who delighted in tearing apart the ordinary to expose the extraordinary hiding inside it. Scheele routinely reduced pigments and salts down to their fundamental essences. In the 1780s, he turned his attention to the puzzling blue, subjecting it to aggressive acid treatment and heat. In 1782, he described what he called prussic acid, a name that tied this new volatile substance back to its colorful origin. He wrote in the cautious observational style chemists favor of a colorless liquid that gave off a biting vapor, a smell some compared to bitter almonds, and an effect on living creatures that demanded a different level of respect than, say, laudanum or arsenic. Scheele's notes carried both wonder and a quiet warning. He had isolated what we now refer to as hydrogen cyanide, HCN, but he named it for where it came from, prussic acid, the acid born from Prussian blue. Names matter. The story of prussic acid is also a story about language wrapping itself around discovery. For 2 generations, chemists spoke of prussic acid, or in German, Blausäure blue acid, because the compound's first close encounter with human curiosity came through that strange iron cyanide pigment. Later, as chemical nomenclature became more systematic and confident, the root of the substance's name shifted from national identity to classical etymology. Kyanos, the Greek word for a dark blue, was drafted into service. From kyanos, we get kyan, and from that, the chilly, compact syllables cyanide, which now sit on the tongues of generals, medical examiners, and historians alike. There is a muted irony in that lineage. A word built from the color of beauty now names an agent of instant withdrawal. The chemists who came after Sheila did not stop there. They broke the acid into radicals and salts, showing that this volatile molecule had a covalent life as HCN and an ionic life as CN, and that this simple pairing could disguise itself in countless forms. The same carbon-nitrogen triple bond that gives the cyanosyllable its menace is, at its core, simply a matter of geometry and valence. Linear, triple bonded, with a carbon atom 1 electron pair short of a full set, and a nitrogen more than willing to share electrons. In many respects, it behaves like a pseudo-halide, mimicking halogens in its chemistry. It can become the backbone of very stable complexes with transition metals, or the reactive heart of a deadly vapor. In wood, in soil, and in the carefully controlled hands of an alchemist, it will adopt roles that are sometimes highly useful and sometimes extremely dangerous. Once scientists recognized this dual nature, the gaseous parent, HCN, and the cyanide ion, CN, industrial imagination followed quickly. Hydrogen cyanide is a small, volatile molecule. At ordinary room temperature, it exists as a gas with a faint almond-like smell that only some people can detect. A quirk of human genetics that made early warning by odor unreliable. In air, HCN dissipates and travels. In water, it sets up an equilibrium with its ionized form. Acid-base balance becomes the key to its behavior. Because hydrogen cyanide is a weak acid, at physiologic pH most of it remains as undissociated HCN. Only a small fraction exists as CN in the bloodstream, yet that small fraction acts with disproportionate brutality. Uncharged HCN drifts across biological membranes with little resistance. Once inside the watery interior of the cell, local conditions coax it toward ionization. And there, as CN, it encounters metal centers in enzymes and proteins to which it has a remarkable affinity. Out in factories and smelters, the cyanide story branched again. In one guise, cyanide appears as salts. White brittle crystals, like sodium cyanide and potassium cyanide materials that stay stable when kept dry, and that miners and metallurgists have used for generations. In another, it is locked inside complex ions, such as ferrocyanide and ferrocyanide, where iron coordinates the CN groups into a lattice that is, at least at first glance, benign. Prussian blue itself is a form of iron-bound cyanide, whose stability comes from that cage-like network of metal centers embracing the CN ligands. Yet even these seemingly secure complexes can be coaxed into releasing their volatile offspring under the right conditions. Acidify them, and suddenly the air takes on that faint almond taste. The chemistry is generous and far-reaching. The same CN fragment wanders into organic chemistry as the nitrile group, from acetonitrile, a common solvent, to benzonitrile and countless synthetic intermediates. Each of these nitriles brings its own toxicological profile, its own metabolic fate, its own mix of routine usefulness and occasional hazard. By the 19th century, methods of making and using cyanide had grown from lab-scale curiosity to commercial production. Hydrogen cyanide became an industrial feedstock, a building block for plastics via acrylonitrile and other organics. Cyanide salts found a large market in metallurgy. Among the most historically important technological shifts was the MacArthur Forest cyanide process, patented in 1887, which enabled the leaching of gold from low-grade ores on an industrial scale. The gold men of the late 19th and early 20th centuries embraced this new alchemy. Rock that had once been economically worthless suddenly yielded fortunes. Entire mining towns rose in the wake of that promise. The volume of cyanide moving through industry and the logistics of shipping it, stockpiling it, and discarding its residues would eventually produce a second, darker narrative, one of spills, environmental disasters, and the slow building of regulation. If you zoom in close to the chemical action with the figurative microscope of a biochemist, the story becomes painfully intimate. The cyanide ion is a ligand with an exceptional appetite for transition metals. Inside the mitochondria, the tiny stages where each living cell performs its breathing. The electron transport chain. ferries electrons along a precise path until they reach the final gate. Cytochrome C oxidase, complex IV, where electrons reduce oxygen to water. That molecular gate is constructed of special components, heme centers and copper sites laid out to usher electrons along and to open the door to life by using oxygen as the final electron acceptor. Cyanide behaves like a determined pickpocket stationed at that door. It slips in and grabs the metal center, binding tightly to the ferric form of heme A3 and interacting with the copper to block the transfer of electrons to oxygen. The oxygen that reaches the cell becomes useless. The lungs can be full, and yet the cell suffocates. The clinical picture follows this logic precisely. Cells lose the ability to generate ATP through oxidative phosphorylation. Anaerobic workarounds stumble into place, briefly, producing lactic acid. The organs with the highest demand for energy, the brain and the heart, are the first and worst to suffer. Damage comes quickly. Inhaled concentrated HCN can kill within minutes. Swallowing cyanide salts can lead to equally rapid collapse. The human body does have defenses. A set of sulfur transferase enzymes, including rhodonase in the mitochondria, can convert cyanide into thiocyanate, a much less toxic ion that the kidneys can excrete in urine. The blood also carries heme proteins that, if oxidized to methemoglobin by specific agents, can temporarily bind and sequester cyanide A trick physicians would later use deliberately in antidotal treatments. Modern antidotes build on these same affinities, sulfur donors that speed the conversion of CN to thiocyanate, and hydroxycobalamin, which binds cyanide directly to form cyanocobalamin. We linger on these biochemical details not to offer a manual for harm, but to emphasize how the molecule's preferences, its tastes for certain metals, its volatility, its acid-base behavior, create both danger and remedy. How cyanide acts in air, in water, and inside living tissue explains its strange recurring role in human history. In air, hydrogen cyanide sweeps through enclosed spaces, acting almost immediately. In solution, cyanine is a reactive ion, a skilled nucleophile and ligand chemistry's flexible multi-tool, indispensable in organic synthesis and metallurgical work. Within the body, HCN's volatility and pKa allow it to slip inside, where CNE can behave like a hidden saboteur, using the pH and structure of each compartment to move quietly while remaining chemically modest on paper. The same trait that makes cyanide so useful in gold extraction, its eagerness to grab metal ions and form complexes, makes it merciless when those metal ions are the very locks that cells use to capture the energy of life. So cyanide does not lend itself to a neat moral fable. A stable ferrocyanide, such as potassium ferricyanide, can sit calmly in a bag of fertilizer or as a food additive at low concentration, wrapped in a kind of salt cellophane of safety. Another form, sodium cyanide, will dissolve an entire hillside to reveal a few shining flecks of metal. What matters is the form, the setting, and the purpose. Science learned to treat these distinctions with a mix of caution and appetite. Chemistry opened doors for industry that demanded new systems of oversight, rules for handling and storage, monitoring of waste, standards for transportation, and new traditions of risk assessment. Once cyanide was produced in bulk and deployed across sectors, it no longer belonged solely to the lab. It now belonged to rivers, to tailings ponds, to rail cars and warehouses. That shift had consequences that would eventually echo far beyond the original quarrels inside the Berlin dye works. Long before industry and formal laboratories, people met cyanide in their fields and kitchens. The world of plants and people had its own, much older chemistry. For thousands of years, farmers and cooks learned to read bitterness and mistrust certain seeds. Bitter almonds, Prunus dulcis var. Amara contain amygdalin, a cyanogenic glycoside that, when the plant cells are crushed or chewed and exposed to their own enzymes, breaks down into benzaldehyde and hydrogen cyanide. Inside that almond kernel lies the scent we now associate with prussic acid. At the hearth, cooks discovered that when certain methods of preparation were followed, a dessert could carry the aroma of almonds without carrying death. The same underlying chemistry plays out in the starchy root that historians know by many names: manioc, yucca, cassava. Manihot esculenta, first domesticated in the Amazon basin and carried outward by human migration throughout the Americas, crossed the Atlantic with European traders and found a second home in Africa and parts of Asia. It was a botanical blessing. Cassava tolerates poor soils and drought, yielding calories where more delicate crops fail, but the plant hides a chemical trick in its leaves and tubers: linamarin and lotorstrolin, cyanogenic glycosides that keep an ace tucked up the root sleeve. When the tuber is grated, chewed, fermented, or simply left to rot without proper processing, enzymes, linamarase among them, unmask the cyanide by cleaving the sugar away and generating acetone cyanohydrin or hydrogen cyanide itself. The mere act of crushing the tissue releases an invisible agent that, in a small but potent dose, can dismantle the body. This was not, and still is not, a mystery to traditional communities. Indigenous peoples of the Amazon and villages across Africa developed a toolkit of processing techniques precisely tuned to the plant's chemistry: grating, soaking, pressing out the juice, fermenting the pulp, drying it in the sun, roasting it over open fire. These are all ways humans learned to move HCN out of a staple and into the air, leaving behind safe food. In the Americas, cassava bread was made by scraping and squeezing the root to remove its bitter juices before drying and grinding the residue. In West Africa, the making of gari and fufu centers on the same principles of fermentation, pressing, and careful drying. Taste and texture became systems of practical knowledge. If a food bit at the tongue, like an especially bitter kernel, it still needed more work. These practices are wisdom in action, handed down across generations. In stable times, they kept cyanide at arm's length. But when social order phrase that wisdom proves fragile, under the stress of war, famine, forced migration, or economic collapse, people may shorten or skip the laborious steps. When hunger presses in, families may eat poorly processed cassava, and public health failures follow. During the 20th century, doctors, anthropologists, and epidemiologists documented outbreaks of both acute cyanide poisoning, dizzying, violent, sometimes fatal, and of a chronic neurological condition called konzo, a non-progressive paralysis of the legs that can leave people unable to walk on their own. Konzo and related syndromes of subacute cyanide exposure appear in medical records from rural Africa during periods of drought, conflict, or displacement times when communities are driven to rush cassava preparation and when diets lack the protein and sulfur-containing amino acids needed for the body's own detoxification pathways. The pattern is bleak and instructive. Chemistry operates within social systems. Toxicity is not just an inherent trait of molecules, it arises from logistics, labor, and poverty. The modern era layered new distortions on top of these older folk chemistries. In the mid-20th century, a compound rooted in the same botanical law, amygdalin, was repackaged as laetrile and marketed as an alternative cancer treatment. Advocates claimed that laetrile, sometimes branded as vitamin B17, would selectively poison cancer cells while sparing the rest of the body. Their story wove together lab anecdotes and folk tales into a direct-to-consumer promise of a magic bullet against cancer. But as clinical trials and pharmacology eventually made clear, this story misread both biology and evidence. Trials in the US and elsewhere found no credible anti-cancer benefit. They did, however, record cases of cyanide poisoning tied to laetrile consumption and to eating apricot kernels. The laetrile episode became, in the 1970s and beyond, a cultural and regulatory flashpoint. Clinics just over the Mexican border attracted American patients. The FDA and cancer research organizations pushed back with lawsuits and data. The whole affair became a cautionary tale about how seductive simple promises can be when set against the terror of cancer. There is something tender in that warning. Ethnobotanical knowledge is not mere superstition, it is a craft built up over centuries, honed to local ecosystems and rhythms of work. The people who learned to ferment cassava or cook bitter almonds did so with their senses, with hand-measured timing rather than instruments, under the oldest safety test of all: survival. The modern world's failure was not just in ignoring that wisdom, but in flattening and commercializing it, turning amygdalin into a commodity of hope, stripped of the social context that had made its use safe. From this, public health draws several clear lessons. Respect local knowledge, don't swap marketing slogans for controlled trials, and make sure that access to information and resources grows in step with the expansion of risk. Across the arc from Prussian blue to prussic acid, from pigment to poison, cyanide has accumulated metaphors: accidental beauty, then scientific riddle, then workhorse of industry, then clandestine instrument for those who wield chemistry as power. It has been a kitchen hazard and a symptom of social fragility. The common thread through all these incarnations is not just chemistry, but choice. How societies decide to process, regulate, teach, and remember. The blue that once warmed palace interiors became, in time, a chemical that could slide unnoticed into a human lung and act within minutes. The irony is not subtle. The very etymology of its name, kyanos, dark blue, keeps the pigment's memory alive in every utterance of cyanide. More modest still is the human story that runs alongside. That a molecule so elegant in structure could serve as a tool of extraction, a desperate last resort, and a reminder of what happens when practice is cut short and knowledge travels without its context. Close your eyes and picture the late 18th century labs of Europe, the breath rising from Scheele's distillations, the drafty Berlin dye workshops where a blue first startled its makers. There, at the edges of glassware and open vats, you find the same quiet mixture of wonder and risk that has followed cyanide ever since. In the kitchens of the Amazon or the courtyards of West Africa, where cassava is grated under a blazing sun and the juice seeps into the dirt, you find a counter-tradition, careful, patient, pragmatic. Those are cyanide's two intertwined stories, the technical and the social, chemistry nested inside custom. To understand cyanide in full, you have to see both. You have to see how the secret of a pigment can ripple into geopolitics, how the chemistry of a root can grow into a public health emergency, and how a single small ion can pull into focus questions of industrial scale, colonial trade, wartime logistics, and the humble art of cooking. There is a dry, slightly cruel humor in the way a color named for a rising kingdom gave rise to plumes of molecules that ended up in mine tailings and in the folklore of assassins. But there is also a steadier satisfaction in human ingenuity. The same science that explained how this compound kills also devised ways to neutralize it, to lock it safely into complexes, and to reduce its presence in crops. The tales of bitter almonds, apricot pits, and cassava share a common theme about prevention. The techniques that cut risk are often simple: time, fermentation, warmth, patience. And yet their consistent use depends on social stability and justice. When those supports crack, the chemistry reasserts itself with the blunt impartiality of nature. So the first chapter of cyanide's history closes, and the molecule, small and stubborn, steps into larger histories. From Diesbach's dye to Scheele's distillations, from a blue-rooted name to industrial furnaces and kitchen fires, cyanide has been a teacher of contrasts. Beauty can shelter danger, old knowledge can avert disaster. Technology can enrich and endanger at once. As a historian, I note the key dates and milestones. The Berlin dye works around 1706, Scheele's work in the 1780s, the 19th century industrial uptake that made this molecule ubiquitous. As a storyteller, I say that the modern world learned to clothe and to poison itself with the same hand. The blue stayed beautiful, the acid stayed deadly. We simply learned how to live with both. A craftsman's mistake in a small Berlin dye shop in 1706 began, like many turning points in industrial history, with the wrong substance in the right pot. Johann Jacob Diesbach was dyeing leather and cloth, reaching for the familiar reds drawn from cochineal and madder, when one batch turned stubbornly, almost provocatively blue. This blue was no faint wash, no shy hint of color. It was a deep, almost dangerous blue, the blue of river depths and of a night sky that seems to remember every city it has ever covered. The hue that emerged from Diesbach's vats would, in time, become a color that rearranged markets and laboratories alike. At first, people called it Berliner Blau. Others, taken by its regal depth and by the prestige of the state that helped underwrite its trade, named it Prussian Blue. The name fit. Prussia was the rising power on the map, efficient, hungry for manufacturing, and the pigment matched the mood. In the workshops of early 18th century Berlin, the air would have smelled of boiled hides, tannins, smoke, and new chemical brews. The clatter of wood paddles in iron kettles, merchants counting cloth while apprentices tended fires. The surprise of deep blue where cochineal red was expected was eventually traced to contamination. A potash salt from one supplier contained something that, when combined with iron, cochineal, and an alkaline environment, produced a complex of iron with a then unknown ligand. No one would call it cyanide for another 50 years. For a time, people simply admired the shade and sold it on cloth, on ceilings, on ship hulls, on soldiers' sleeves. It cost less than ultramarine, the most expensive blue, ground from lapis lazuli, and that price gap mattered immensely. Painters were among the first to seize on it. Artists' palettes in London and Paris filled with the new blue. Landscape painters discovered they could portray sea and sky with a new ruthlessness of clarity, laying down deep, transparent washes. A century later, J.M.W. Turner and John Constable would use it to make the North Sea and English skies seem almost alive. In Japan, imported Berliner Blau would reframe the world for ukiyo-e printmakers like Katsushika Hokusai, whose Mount Fuji took on an almost electric seriousness in a pigment that had traveled across oceans. The arrival of the pigment did more than brighten canvases and wardrobes. It posed a question to the fledgling science of chemistry. What exactly was this tenacious blue? Chemists and apothecaries, both amateurs and professionals, took up the challenge. How could this color be so saturated and so stable when so many earlier blues had been disappointingly fugitive? By the late 18th century, a Swedish apothecary could coax from the pigment a faint acid-scented vapor that others had begun calling prussic. Like a ghostly ancestor, the gas hinted at a hidden chemistry inside the solid. Carl Wilhelm Scheele, in 1782, and others around him, isolated prussic acid, what we now call hydrogen cyanide, from materials including Prussian blue, bitter almonds, and fermenting plant matter. The discovery was not just an academic curiosity. It suggested that the pigment's blue was a visible sign of a whole family of complex compounds in which carbon, nitrogen, and iron interacted in ways chemists had never before imagined. That moment when artisans' problems collided with chemical theory, when the salon peered into the dye house, was decisive. Demand for Prussian blue pushed entrepreneurs to scale production. A color that had been a serendipitous oddity now required kilns, bigger vats, imported alkali, and steady supplies of iron. Factories appeared not only in Berlin, but also in Britain's textile towns and France's porcelain centers. Parisian decorators flooded grand galleries and tapestries with the new blue. French faience makers discovered that their plates and vases sold better when the blues could rival costly ultramarine. Industrial chimneys went up, warehouses filled. The pigment proved relatively stable. It didn't bleach in sunlight the way some organic dyes did. It could be worked into glazes and oils, into warp and weft, into printed paper and book illustrations. Demand for Prussian blue thus meant demand for the chemicals behind it. Curiosity gave birth to chemistry. Chemistry gave birth to manufacturing. Prussian blue made visible the interdependence of craft and laboratory method. It pushed figures like Jöns Jakob Berzelius and others not just to name chemicals, but to analyze them. The ferrocyanide ion, the very motif behind Prussian blue, drew special interest. It was a complex anion, an iron atom at its center bound to a cage of carbon and nitrogen atoms, those carbons and nitrogens themselves coordinating around yet another iron. When Berzelius and his colleagues probed these materials in the early 1800s, they were grappling with a concept that would underpin much of modern industrial chemistry: ligands, coordination complexes, the notion that metals and surrounding ions could form stable architectures that could be built and rebuilt in the factory. Out of this abstract tinkering came concrete products. Prussian blue, ironically, remained both a luxury and a workhorse. Physicians used it as a treatment for certain heavy metal poisonings, and histologists used it to stain tissues, a quiet mnemonic of its chemical roots. Yet the very processes used to make Prussian blue heating animal or vegetable nitrogenous matter with potassium and iron salts. Evaporating, crystallizing produced byproducts chemists couldn't ignore. Cyanide salts in various forms, ferrocyanides and ferrocyanides, and simpler alkali cyanides. The artisan's pigment had become a gateway into a broader universe of carbon-nitrogen chemistry. Once that door opened, industry forced it wider. The century that began with Diesbach's lucky accident ended with factories turning out cyanides by the ton, feeding metallurgical plants, photography studios, electroplating shops, and other industries that required strong, precise reagents. The motive was always economic. An affordable, intense blue drove fashion. But it was what cyanide chemistry could do that truly reshaped resource extraction on a global scale. Roughly a century and a half after the Berlin episode, a Scottish chemist named John Stuart MacArthur, working with the Forest brothers, patented the process, now known as the MacArthur Forest cyanide leaching method, in 1887. It transformed geology into profit in a way earlier miners could scarcely imagine. Gold had been coveted for millennia, but extracting it from rock had largely depended on rich veins and luck. The cyanide process changed that, allowing gold to be dissolved out of low-grade ores, making vast deposits commercially viable. Where once shafts had to chase visible veins, now entire mountains of low-grade rock could be crushed and processed. The value of a mountain could be written down as dollars per ton. The underlying chemistry was straightforward and to many industrialists almost suspiciously simple. In the presence of oxygen, gold prefers not to remain as free metal when cyanide is around. It forms a stable, soluble complex, AuCN, SUNS, pulverized ore exposed to aqueous sodium or potassium cyanide under aerated conditions releases gold that had been locked in sulfides or silicates. The gold is then recovered, often by precipitating it with zinc dust in the classic process, and collected. This method moved wealth quickly from rock into vaults. Early large-scale use took root in the goldfields of South Africa and Australia, then spread worldwide. Miners short on rich veins but long on low-grade yet extensive ore bodies finally had a way forward. In South Africa's Witwatersrand, the process met enormous gravel beds rich in dispersed gold. Within a few years, Johannesburg grew from a gold rush camp into a city of capital, labor, rail lines, and smelters. The MacArthur Forest method sat like a hinge between centuries, converting geology into a modern mining industry that depended on railroads, cyanide plants, reservoirs, and vats big enough to drown a workshop floor in reflected sky. Companies merged and expanded. Investment pools formed to build cyanide works and purchase ore. The method also encouraged speculation. What was once worthless rock could now be booked as a resource, bought, sold, or held in reserve. Entire social structures, towns, contracts, international commodity markets grew around the simple fact that you could buy a stone and, with chemistry, make it pay. But this new logic carried human and environmental costs. Cyanide is efficient, and not just at dissolving gold. Tailings ponds, those watery graveyards of spent ore, filled with cyanide-laced sludge. Mines often dumped their chemical brews into rivers or unlined ponds with poor containment. Fish disappeared. Farmers saw their land decline. Workers mixed powders and solutions in poorly ventilated sheds with minimal or non-existent protective gear. From early on, the hazards were recognized, but weakly regulated profits outweighed caution, and the chemical industry was still in the middle of writing its own rulebook for large-scale production. There were ruptured pipes that sprayed cyanide, fumes in unventilated rooms, spills that killed downstream villages' fish and fouled their wells. Official responses often treated such events as unfortunate but essentially unavoidable costs of doing business. Workers were handed simple antidotes, sodium nitrite and sodium thiosulfate, and told to be careful. Employer liability was limited. Where lawsuits cropped up, they could drag on for decades. The social fabric of Gold Town's migrant workers, precarious housing, racial hierarchies, colonial legal systems meant that the burden of exposure fell most heavily on those with the least power. Beyond the immediate dangers, the very normalization of cyanide in industry had subtler effects. Cyanide became just another tool, supplied in sacks, shipped on trains, handled by thousands of workers. Chemical companies specialized in producing sodium and potassium cyanide cheaply, pushing costs down and use up. The reagent spread into electroplating, organic synthesis, and more. Technology, any technology, does what it's built to do without moral instincts. It's the social and political channels that give it direction. And those channels can run very dark. The same features that made hydrogen cyanide an effective pesticide, its volatility, its speed, its ability to permeate a closed space, made it horrifyingly easy to adapt for purposes having nothing to do with insects. Through much of the 19th and early 20th centuries, hydrogen cyanide, still widely known as prussic acid, because of its origin, was used as an insecticide and fumigant. Ships and quarantine stations needed ways to kill lice and vermin. Old prisons had rat and bedbug problems. Warehouses storing grain were under constant assault by pests. In Germany, in the 1920s, an industrial product called Zyklon B was developed and sold as a disinfectant and pesticide. The name was prosaic, Zyklon as in cyclone, B for the second formulation. It was marketed in sealed cans with warning labels and careful instructions. The active ingredient was hydrogen cyanide, absorbed onto a carrier that allowed slow release once the can was opened, ensuring the gas would permeate bedding, crates, and cracks. For customers who used it as labeled, it was a tool against insects and rodents. For others, it would be turned into a device for killing human beings. The technical reasons behind HCN selection in that monstrous reinvention were chillingly mundane. In high enough concentration inside a sealed room, the gas is inhaled rapidly, enters the bloodstream, and binds to cytochrome Ca oxidase, halting cellular respiration. Death comes quickly at sufficient dose. The gas dissipates with ventilation. It is colorless and often only faintly aromatic. Only some people can detect the almond-like odor. It can be introduced under the guise of disinfection and then removed without obvious physical traces. To the bureaucratic mind, it appeared efficient. In the administrative vocabulary of the Third Reich, it was described as hygienic. But the transformation from pesticide to instrument of genocide did not emerge from chemistry alone. It required logistics, procurement, contracts, silence. By the 1930s, the Nazi state apparatus, with its ministries, offices, and semi-state corporations, had matured into a machine capable of sourcing and distributing materials across Europe. The SS built its own economic division, with purchasing offices and receiving depots. Chemical firms such as Degesch, Deutsche Gesellschaft für Schädlingsbekämpfung, and companies like Tesch and Stabenow manufactured Zyklon B. Chemical engineers ran the production lines. Accountants balanced ledgers. Workers packed cans and glued labels. Somewhere between those factory hands and the camp gas chambers lay a chain of men who placed orders for palletized tins, who arranged sealed trucks, who oversaw the installation of heavy airtight doors. There is something monstrously procedural in this. Technologies made for household hygiene and commerce were adapted for killing because ideology, state power, and a bureaucracy obsessed with efficiency found in that commodity a workable solution. Mass murder by gas required more than just a toxic compound in a sealed room. It demanded technical knowledge: how much product to use, how long to seal the chamber, how to ventilate afterward, how to remove bodies, how to destroy or reuse clothing, how to maintain a reliable pipeline of gas. Much of that expertise grew out of industrial practice. Civilian chemists and engineers scaled production and refined formulations. The SS learned how many cans contained how many grams of HCN, which temperatures favored faster volatilization, how long it took sealed rooms to reach lethal concentrations, and how ambient temperature affected efficiency. After the war, those networks of logistics and industry could not be separated from questions of responsibility. The Allied tribunals did not treat the gas simply as an abstract hazard. They treated participation in the supply chain as complicity, when knowledge and intent could be shown. In 1946, a British military court tried and convicted Bruno Tesch and Karl Weinbacher of Tesch and Stabenow for supplying Zyklon B to the SS with knowledge of its murderous use. Both men were executed. These trials underscored an uncomfortable truth. A chemical sold openly as a pest control product could, in the hands of a criminal state and cooperating businesses, be turned into a tool of industrial murder. The legal cases were complex. Manufacturers and sales agents often claimed they had only limited knowledge of how their products were used, or that they faced coercion. Wartime commerce generated a thick fog in which denial could hide. But records of repeated deliveries to extermination sites made pure ignorance difficult to sustain. This reckoning went beyond courtrooms into public memory and regulatory practice. How do you hold responsible the engineer who designed an air vent, or the chemist who optimized a process when their work is used by others for atrocity? Those questions forced new thinking about professional ethics, corporate accountability, and the acceptable limits of secrecy and just following orders. Nations debated whether legal frameworks could meaningfully address the moral dimensions of chemical manufacture and trade. Could international agreements prevent pesticides and disinfectants from being diverted into tools of mass killing? The answer was piecemeal and slow. The 1925 Geneva Protocol had outlawed poison gas in warfare, but it did not, and arguably could not, stop a regime from using a civilian product to murder people within its own borders. It took new norms, new treaties, and the heavy weight of memory before chemical firms tightened their distribution practices and national governments began building more serious oversight into the flow of toxic materials. Yet it would be a mistake to frame Cyanide's story solely around Auschwitz and Zyklon B. As horrifying as that chapter is, the history of human use and misuse of cyanide has many other points of contact. Long before industrial fumigants and modern gas chambers, cyanide in various forms found a place in courts and prisons. Through the 19th and 20th centuries, some execution protocols used hydrogen cyanide as their chosen agent of death. Legislatures and prison systems experimented with chemicals in search of a supposedly more humane method. A toxin that caused rapid respiratory collapse seemed to some reformers less gruesome than hanging. In the United States during the 20th century, sealed gas chambers using cyanide were employed for executions. Later, in the era of lethal injection, cyanide resurfaced in a different context. In suicide pills and capsules, small fast-acting devices that agents and spies might carry to avoid capture. The British Special Operations Executive, SOE, during World War II, issued poison tubes to some operatives as a last resort. The logic there was the same as in the fugitive's hand: a single, predictable chemical that could be carried discreetly and used, if necessary, to ensure there would be no interrogation, no trial. Cyanide appears in the margins of wartime killing outside Europe as well. Allegations, often hard to document, fully have surfaced of cyanide and cyanide-based methods being used in certain colonial and counterinsurgency operations where secrecy and impunity obstructed thorough investigation. Industrial cyanide also remained a source of accidental and sometimes deliberate mass killings. Mining disasters and tailings, dam collapses that dumped cyanide into rivers, wiping out fish and poisoning water supplies. The Baia Mare disaster in Romania in 2000, chronologically later than most of this narrative, but conceptually linked, serves as a grim reminder. When tailings dams fail, cyanide shows no regard for job titles or borders. It kills fish, fouls drinking water, undercuts livelihoods. It would be easy and emotionally satisfying to cast cyanide as a purely evil chemical in a tidy morality play, one that begins with a blue pigment and ends with genocide. But the real record is more tangled. Cyanide is a small ion with specific physical traits that suit many human purposes. In medicine, Prussian blue has served as a treatment for other poisons. In art, cyanide complexes created a color that altered how people painted oceans and skies. In metallurgy, cyanide enabled wealth to be extracted from ground that had once been worthless. Those same properties made it a tool for extermination, once a murderous regime. Supportive industries and a culture of obedience aligned. The lesson in that trajectory is strategic, rather than merely moralizing. Technologies rarely serve only one purpose. They exist within networks of production, distribution, regulation, and use. Once a technology becomes standardized, sold by the kilogram, described in manuals, backed by spare parts and trained technicians, its potential uses multiply in directions its inventors may never have foreseen. The blue that began in Diesbach's pot behaved as pigments always do. It revealed a chemistry that people then exploited. That visual joy fed into methods of production, which fed into a chemical economy of extraction, which in turn was nationalized, militarized, and, at its worst, turned to genocide. The seams between art and industry, between manufacturing and murder, are not only metaphorical, they are built from pipes, kilns, railcars, paperwork. At each seam, someone designed a process, signed a form, scheduled a delivery. The world learned, slowly and painfully, that it needed counterbalances. Worker safety laws grew teeth. Environmental rules about tailings ponds and discharges tightened. Eventually, international conventions sought to wall off certain uses of toxic chemicals. The Chemical Weapons Convention of 1993 outlawed the development, production, and stockpiling of chemical weapons, including some cyanide-based agents, for warfare. It could not, of course, erase cyanide from legitimate agriculture or industry, but it did place the use of chemicals like HCN for mass killing beyond the bounds of acceptable state behavior in the eyes of most of the world. There is a macabre irony in the way the old name Prussian blue persists. A color outlives the empire that named it. Traders, painters, and chemists may shift their loyalties, but they share markets. The pigment helped democratize color artists who once had only earth tones, and lead whites could now reach for deep sea blues and nocturnal shadows. That democratization of material culture, on its surface, brightened lives. It also taught the industrial world a broader lesson, that chemicals produced at scale become part of infrastructure. Once a compound becomes a standard reagent or commodity, it is no longer a curiosity. It is an input. From that point on, the landscape of industry bends in ways that only war, markets, and design decisions can fully explain. History is rarely a single moral arc. It's a braided rope of intention and accident, applied genius and bureaucratic neglect, beauty and horror. Prussian blue is both a luminous pigment in a Turner seascape and a cyanide-based complex that opened the door to powerful reagents. The MacArthur Forest process is both a brilliant way to free gold from rock and a driver of cities and ecological damage. Hydrogen cyanide is both a fumigant in shipholds and, when harnessed by a genocidal state, an instrument of mass murder. The historian's work and the storyteller's is to hold these strands together long enough for us to see how each leads into the next. not to reduce everything to simple blame when what we are really dealing with is collective complicity and technological momentum, but to notice how ordinary decisions scale into industrial and moral consequences. One last curious note before we drift towards sleep. The word's etymology itself is a tiny chain of history. Cyan from the Greek kyanos, dark blue. Prussic from Prussia. A name that began in a dye shop ends up in chemistry textbooks, mining ledgers, and wartime procurement files. Names travel like pigments carried by hands and ships, and the slow appetite of capital. Cyanide's history lies in that travel, in factories and in fieldwork, in chemists whose notebooks walked from parlor labs into mills, and in governments that sometimes chose to turn a convenient technology toward ends its inventors never imagined. We don't have to end this part of the story in despair. If anything, tracing the path shows that the same organizational skill that carried cyanide from pigment to poison can be harnessed in reverse to keep humble industrial goods from becoming tools of atrocity again. Oversight, regulation, ethical engineering, and a real commitment to human rights in procurement are as concrete as any bohemian kiln or ore vat. The blue that once brightened canvases can remain something to admire. The chemical that brought both riches and ruin can be hemmed in by rules, monitored, and remembered not as a source of paralyzing guilt, but as a guide. Technologies arrive in the world capable of being beautiful, useful, and dangerous at the same time. It is the human chain, those who design, those who sell, those who buy, those who avert their eyes, that determines the eventual use. So sleep now, if you can, with the image of that deep, stubborn blue born in Berlin, and with an awareness of how a color tugged at the threads of industry, extraction, and atrocity. The story is long because its consequences have been tangled through centuries. The pigment led to industrial chemistry. Industrial chemistry pulled metals from stone. Industry generated both wealth and risk. And whenever states and corporations chose convenience and efficiency over human lives, an ordinary commodity became extraordinary in the worst possible way. Heinrich Himmler bit down on something small with the same mechanical calm he had shown in his offices and camps, and a long, terrible machinery of empire collapsed into a single private act. It happened on May 23, 1945, under British custody near Lüneburg, weeks after Germany's surrender. The man who had organized police and SS, who had traced lines on maps that translated into hundreds of thousands of deaths, had hidden away a tiny capsule, an old familiar ally of desperate men, and used it to escape any courtroom's reckoning. 2 days earlier, another architect of that system had made a different arrangement in a bunker beneath the ruined center of Berlin. On April 30, 1945, Adolf Hitler staged his final scene with a combination of cyanide and a firearm. Eva Braun, companion, brief wife and partner in his final private theater, swallowed what she had been handed and then slipped out of life with a quiet she had never experienced in public. The cameras wept. History did not. Cyanide's prominence in the final acts of tyrants is not a trivial detail. It is part of the architecture of defeat. It shows up in the margins of last wills, in the pockets of disgraced ministers, in assassination plots, and in the small metal interiors of concealed vials. The appeal is brutally pragmatic. People who ruled through violence and secrecy, who built their power on networks of informants and surveillance, saw in a public trial the ultimate opposite of what they had cultivated: an orderly, slow dismantling of their myth in a brightly lit adversarial arena. Cyanide offers a different calculus, a fast exit, a refusal of spectacle, a theft of the state's final accounting. It becomes a last instrument of control, a way to reclaim personal agency at the very end, a private strike against public humiliation. Take the case of Erwin Rommel, the celebrated field marshal admired, showcased by the Nazi regime, and later tied to the July 20th plot to assassinate Hitler. On October 14, 1944, Hitler's envoys confronted Rommel with what they framed as a choice. He could accept a state funeral and safety for his family in exchange for silence and his life. Rommel swallowed cyanide that same day. The official narrative remained intact. No show trial, no messy unraveling of what had been done in staff rooms and on battlefields. The regime allowed its general to die with honors, while the truth drifted around the edges of the story like smoke. These deaths are as much choreography as escape. They allow regimes to manage the optics of their own collapse, to confine shame to the private sphere, to hold off the probing questions courts and historians usually bring. Hermann Göring, convicted at Nuremberg and sentenced to hang, used cyanide in October 1946 to ensure the state's final gesture could not touch him. On the morning of his scheduled execution, an episode retold with relish by lawyers and hangmen alike, he slipped a capsule, reportedly hidden in a jar of skin cream, into his mouth and crushed it. There is a dark symmetry here. A man who supervised an empire's rewards and punishments found in a cosmetic container the means to outmaneuver the gallows. When the world assembled in Nuremberg to practice a new kind of international justice, the man who once plotted in lounges and council chambers chose to exit on his own terms. However clear his guilt and symbolic his conviction, that act muddied the public ledger. The law cannot hang a man who has already killed himself. The definitive neatness of a state execution gave way to a more ambiguous memory. These suicides, Himmler's hidden capsule in British hands, Göring's last-minute defiance, Rommel's coerced acceptance echo beyond their dates. They form a kind of shared language among tyrants and collaborators, the language of absolute control extended to the final heartbeat. Cyanide becomes not only a physical tool, but a symbol. To refuse the stage of prosecution is to try to preserve a semblance of dignity, no matter how undeserved. To choose silence over testimony is to deny victims the ritual of confronting their oppressor. That denial leaves space for legends of brilliance, of martyrdom, of betrayal. Myths move easily in politics. They can nurture sympathy where none is warranted, or turn outrage into conspiracy. There is also the blunt arithmetic of chaotic endings. In the wreckage of a collapsed regime, overcrowded prisons, rushed tribunals, confused zones of occupation, a quick chemical death may simply be easier to achieve than a tightly scripted public execution. These capsules were small enough to hide in teeth, clothing seams, toiletries. They required nothing more than the decision to use them. Even this grim convenience, though, is mired in technical and forensic complications that leave courts and historians peering through fog. Cyanide works fast. It can complicate early autopsy findings since it causes global tissue hypoxia, and its evidence can be obscured by burns or other injuries. The classic bitter almond odor invoked over and over in fiction is unreliable. A significant portion of people cannot smell it at all. Vapors disperse. A body killed by cyanide may show very little on the outside. All this made certain deaths tidy for those who wanted them to look natural and maddeningly messy for investigators seeking to pin them down. Political questions emerging from these suicides have often mattered as much as the medical ones. When a man who once wore the badges of overwhelming power dies privately, he takes some answers with him and leaves others in doubt. His suicide may prevent the naming of accomplices, or it may freeze the narrative at a particularly painful moment, robbing victims of the catharsis of seeing him confronted. The post-war world learned to distrust neat endings. A single capsule can erase a spectacle, but it cannot delete the networks that enabled atrocities. Where public trials don't happen, or are cut short, denial, revisionism, conspiracy theories, and even rehabilitative myths find room to grow. Think of the waves of speculation that followed Hitler's death. Questions about the burning of the body, the fate of skull fragments, rumors of escape. These conspiracies, often stoked for profit or politics, owe less to the forensic record than to a psychological discomfort with the idea of an abrupt private ending. When closure is denied or made ambiguous, rumor steps in. Nor did every planned suicide work as intended. There are prickly, very human stories of failure. Capsules spoiled by moisture, ampules that induced convulsions but not death, men who changed their minds and begged for help too late. These failures produced their own dramas. A captured man, racked with agony but still alive, might confess during the hours before death. For those seeking justice, such failures sometimes aided investigations. For those crafting national narratives, they complicated the image. Instead of a cold, controlled departure, there was a messy, drawn-out suffering that had to be acknowledged. From this twilight of dictators, the story moves into the clandestine zones where Cyanide's reputation was as powerful as its chemistry. Spycraft likes compact tools, silent, portable, decisive, and Cyanide fit the aesthetic perfectly. Intelligence agencies across the 20th century wrapped a mythology around the little capsule just as surely as their tailors stitched uniforms. It became as much a talisman as an instrument, an emblem worn between the teeth, like a charm against betrayal. This myth had its uses. To give an agent a pill was to send a message. We will not let you be dragged into a show trial. We will not let you be broken in an interrogation cell. At the same time, it was a calculated decision, a risk management and moral judgment expressed chemically. We know in broad strokes that the British SOE, the American OSS, and various German and Soviet intelligence services all weighed the possibility that their people might be captured and interrogated. Captured agents often possessed information far more valuable than their own lives. Radio codes, safe house locations, names of collaborators. A cyanide capsule could, in theory, prevent that knowledge from being torn out. Agents working in occupied France, the Balkans, Eastern Europe, and elsewhere operated under this constant threat. Providing a pill meant accepting a heavy responsibility, the authority to sanction death in the name of secrecy. The lore that grew in memoirs and debriefings is thick with images of capsules passed in cafes, teeth fitted with tiny gold containers, pills taped under tongues. Some stories are solidly documented. The Gestapo, facing resistance networks, was acutely aware of suicide risks. Allied services, anticipating brutal interrogation methods, prepared their people accordingly. But the cinematic image, the spy under a hot lamp, jaw clenching on a flawless black capsule, is only partly true. In reality, capsules were fragile. They could leak during transport. Their potency could degrade if stored poorly. They needed careful handling and clear instructions. Agents were not always thoroughly trained in their use. Panic or doubt could lead to half-chewed pills. Sometimes medical help arrived in time. Sometimes the dose simply wasn't high enough. There are recorded incidents that cut through the romance. Some captured operatives were offered the option and refused it, choosing to endure rather than erase themselves, complicating simple narratives about honor. Others took their pills and died, leaving their own side with lost intelligence and difficult explanations. There were near misses, agents who bit down, seized, and survived thanks to enemy medics, exposing the fallibility of the method. In many cases, the capsule did exactly what it promised: silence. But in others, it created new moral and operational problems. A dead agent cannot be debriefed about what's been compromised. He cannot be traded. The cost-benefit balance of self-annihilation was not straightforward. The capsule also changed interrogation strategies. For interrogators, the possibility that a prisoner might have a suicide pill complicated their work. They had to balance aggressive tactics with the need to prevent the prisoner from dying too soon. That could make them more cautious in some cases. In others, the rumor that a captive might kill himself could be twisted into a psychological tool, used to unsettle, to induce cooperation, or to justify harsher measures on the grounds that time is short. In counterintelligence, simply knowing the enemy had access to cyanide pills became its own weapon. It could be used to taunt, to corrupt morale, or to rationalize extreme tactics. Propaganda grasped the symbolism quickly. States and opposition groups alike crafted narratives around these deaths. Suicide could be cast as cowardly flight or noble refusal. In trial records and memoirs, the capsule image became flexible, molded to each side's needs. A fascist apologist might highlight the heroic last act. A prosecutor might point to suicide as proof of guilt. Soviet narratives folded the capsule into tales of treachery and fifth columns. Western stories used it as shorthand for the ruthlessness of authoritarian systems. Spy novels then took all of this and polished it. Fiction made the capsule small, black, gleaming, focusing on the moment of decision. Readers loved the neatness, a tiny object, a huge consequence. Reality was untidier. As intelligence agencies professionalized in the post-war decades, they debated whether to issue pills at all. Ethical concerns surfaced. Handing someone the means to kill themselves is not morally neutral. Relying on self-destruction can be seen as shirking responsibility for protecting agents. There were pragmatic misgivings too. If a captured agent might be rescued, turned into a double agent or swapped, encouraging suicide could waste opportunities. Agencies weighed the risk of compromised networks against the moral and strategic cost of dead operatives. Some kept the pill as a last-ditch option, others banned it, trying to cultivate a culture of resilience instead of self-erasure. Cyanide's place in spycraft left a cultural residue that outlived many of the organizations that embraced it. The capsule became a trope. Writers and filmmakers chewed on it for decades. For historians, the key is nuance. The pill was one tool in a larger toolkit. Sometimes effective, sometimes not, always ethically fraught, and deeply consequential for how interrogations and operations were conducted. If cyanide haunted the last hours of Dictators and the dark corners of espionage, it also barged into the public square in much more indiscriminate ways. The idea of invisible death entering a soft drink or over-the-counter pill is a particularly modern nightmare. You can buy it in broad daylight and die by accident that evening. Two events in the late 20th century changed how consumers, regulators, and reporters thought about such unseen chemical threats. The mass poisoning coerced suicide at Jonestown, Guyana in 1978, and the Tylenol murders in Chicago in 1982. Very different in motive and setting, both hinged on the idea that something ordinary flavored drink mix, a pain reliever, could be turned into a weapon with added cyanide. On November 18, 1978, in the jungle settlement of Jonestown, the followers of the People's Temple gathered for a carefully organized sequence of deaths. Under Jim Jones's direction, more than 900 people, nearly half of them children, died in a mix of shooting, coercion, and forced ingestion. The group's medical staff prepared a large batch of sweetened drink, commonly described as a powdered beverage, like Flavor Aid, mixed with cyanide and sedatives. The enduring image is of rows of bodies, evidence of a community forced or terrorized into a collective end by a leader who framed it as some twisted form of redemption. Cyanide here was neither a private option nor a stray toxin. It was the central tool in a mass killing delivered through a ritualized scene. The logistics were horrifyingly straightforward. Large containers, a fast-acting poison, and a leader who had spent years building the authority to demand such obedience. Jonestown fixed cyanide in the public mind not just as a suicide agent, but as a means of orchestrated group death. The psychological shock of Jonestown shaped debates about cults, charisma, and state oversight. But its direct regulatory fallout was more muted than that of another incident, the Tylenol murders. In the fall of 1982, in and around Chicago, someone still officially uncaught tampered with several bottles of extra-strength Tylenol capsules on store shelves, inserting potassium cyanide into some of the capsules. 7 people died after taking what they reasonably believed to be routine medication for headaches or minor pain. The killer's motives remain murky: extortion, thrill-seeking, or some other grievance. But the impact was immediate and visceral. We are creatures built on everyday trust. We assume that a sealed bottle in a pharmacy represents a promise between company and consumer. When it became clear that an unseen hand could slip poison into that relationship, trust fractured. Johnson & Johnson's response became a textbook case in crisis management. The company initiated a nationwide recall of roughly 31 million bottles, halted production, and cooperated openly with investigators and the press. This crisis accelerated the rollout of tamper-evident packaging. Foil seals, shrink bands, glued cartons, more conspicuous protective layers. In 1983, Congress passed the Federal Anti-Tampering Act, turning deliberate product tampering into a federal crime. The Tylenol murders permanently changed packaging design and retail practice. The invisible threat was, symbolically at least, made visible in a peel-off seal and a plastic band. The case also pushed forensic chemistry forward. Labs invested in better methods for detecting minute amounts of cyanide in complex consumer products, building quicker test protocols and stricter evidence handling procedures. Jonestown and the Tylenol murders etched two different anxieties into the public imagination. Jonestown linked cyanide to cultic control and the terrifying power of ideology gone malignant. Tylenol linked it to the fragility of consumer trust, the fear that an everyday item on a store shelf might be quietly lethal. Sociologists noticed the behavioral shifts. People stopped leaving medicines unattended. They inspected seals obsessively. A broader paranoia about unseen pollution and sabotage took hold. The media amplified these concerns with images of police lines at suburban drugstores, investigators in protective suits, parents emptying bathroom cabinets. Regulation responded with both hardware and systems. Packaging standards stiffened. Poison control centers strengthened their networks. Manufacturers learned that consumer confidence was economic capital. The cost of redesigning containers was outweighed by the reputational cost of being seen as lax. Emergency response teams drafted protocols for suspected mass poisonings. Hospitals trained to recognize cyanide signs. Antidote kits became more common. Forensic labs refined their ability to track cyanide back through supply chains when possible. But the psychology of poison doesn't move entirely in step with policy. It belongs as much to rumor and narrative as to risk calculations. An invisible, often odorless threat triggers a symbolic fear that far outstrips any statistical probability. After Tylenol, even though the likelihood of being poisoned by store-bought medicine remained vanishingly small, consumer behavior changed sharply. Markets adapted. Some companies shifted from capsules to tablets, which are harder to tamper with unnoticed. Others moved certain products behind the counter or into locked cases. Pop culture filled with new thrillers and urban legends about tainted Halloween candy, poisoned sodas, and toxic pills. The policy gains from these events are only part of the story. There are moral and social lessons too. Jonestown, with its cyanide-laced drink, forced a reckoning with the conditions under which charismatic leaders can convert loyalty into lethal obedience. The Tylenol case taught a more prosaic but profound lesson about the brittleness of everyday trust in an industrial society. Both led to changes that made systems physically safer. Better seals, better detection, but they also highlighted limits. No matter how many layers of plastic you wrap a product in, you cannot eliminate social suspicion entirely. You can only manage it. These episodes made it clear that chemical danger is not just a question of molecules, but of institutions. Who monitors, who enforces, who informs the public afterward? If you trace the line from a dictator's private capsule to a tampered bottle on a drugstore shelf, a pattern emerges. Cyanide's power is at least as psychological as it is biochemical. It can truncate an empire's story, hide or reveal a spy's secrets, or turn a mundane item into a weapon. Because it is small, fast-acting, and often invisible to our senses, cyanide has been repeatedly drafted into dramas of sovereignty, secrecy, and social panic. In each setting, crumbling regimes, interrogation rooms, suburban pharmacies. The recurring theme is control. Who controls life? Who controls information? Who controls how a story ends? For tyrants, cyanide was a last claim to autonomy in a world closing in. For spies, it was a final tool against betrayal and enforced confession. For mass killers and saboteurs, it was a means of anonymous terror. For society, it posed an unsettling puzzle. How do you shield the public from invisible threats without turning every sealed bottle into a fortress and every citizen into a security guard? Historically, we've reached for partial answers: better packaging, tighter policing, quicker medical responses. Forensic science and medicine can sharpen detection and treatment. But a deeper sort of antidote lies in culture: more transparency about risks, greater accountability, and a public narrative that resists the lure of overly neat endings. Tyrants who vanish behind the quiet flash of a poison dose should not be allowed to bury their crimes in the same silence. Spies who trusted in pills remind us of the ethical price of clandestine conflict. Mass poisonings show that technologies of death can outrun the rules meant to restrain them. In archives, museums, trial records, and declassified reports, the small details keep looping back into larger themes. There are lists of names: Himmler, Hitler, Braun, Rommel, Goering, and alongside them, the scarcely remembered names of people killed in public poisonings and of agents who carried pills into occupied cities. The chemical itself has no conscience. It lies inert until chosen. What history reveals is not the inevitability of cyanide's presence, but the human decisions that led to its use. Regimes opting for suicide over trial, agencies handing out tools for self-erasure, individuals weaponizing consumer trust. To understand cyanide is to see in miniature how modern societies balance secrecy, power, and public safety. Night falls on these stories not as closure, but as another layer. The same capsules that gave tyrants a last word cast shadows over institutions that followed. They reshaped interrogations, intelligence practices, packaging standards, and public fears. They underscored an uncomfortable truth. In complex systems, the smallest objects can exert the largest effects. A vial, a hidden ampule, a laced bottle. Each shows how a radical ending is always physically close at hand. The work of society is to make such endings rare, accountable, and, where possible, impossible. In the cool, humming quiet of the morgue, with instruments lined up like patient sentries, cyanide is a ghost that never quite sits still. It leaves Hint's chemical traces, metabolic imprints, then merges into the ordinary chemistry of decay. For the forensic scientist with a body on the table, the challenge is both intimate and time-bound. Hydrogen cyanide is volatile. It can evaporate from the mouth, stomach, and airways. It can be taken into tissues, bound to proteins, converted by enzymes into thiocyanate. It can be obscured by putrefaction, by lime, by fire. The post-mortem interval, the relentless clock that starts when the heart stops, rearranges the evidence. The agent that did its work in seconds may or may not be detectable hours or days later, much less months later when a court finally convenes. A modern forensic lab therefore launches two parallel efforts. One is immediate and practical, the other is slower and more analytical. At the scene or in the ER, simple color tests provide an initial answer. Treated paper strips or small ampules that change hue if cyanide is present. Swabs that turn the telltale Prussian blue in the presence of iron and cyanide. These field tests are quick and suggestive, but crude. They can be fooled by other chemicals, metals, or decomposition products. They are screens, not final answers. In the lab, things become more precise. For volatile hydrogen cyanide, the gas that kills quickly headspace analysis changed the game. The idea is elegant in its simplicity. Seal blood, stomach contents, or tissue in a small vial and warm it gently. Any HCN present migrates into the air pocket above the liquid, the headspace. A tiny sample of that air is then analyzed by gas chromatography mass spectrometry, GC-MS. The gas chromatograph separates components by how they travel through a column. The mass spectrometer identifies them by their molecular fingerprints. A small peak at a known retention time, with the right mass pattern, can confirm HCN. With the advent of reliable, relatively compact GC-MS systems in the late 20th century, forensic chemists gained a powerful way to trap and identify a gas that earlier generations had often lost. But GC-MS requires rigor. Samples must be taken quickly and handled properly, because time and temperature are enemies. A body left warm too long will lose HCN to the air. If a corpse is burned, the direct proof may be gone, leaving only secondary clues. And even when free cyanide is captured, much of it may already have been converted by the body's own enzymes. That's why labs also measure thiocyanate, the main detoxification product of cyanide. Elevated thiocyanate levels in blood or urine can indicate recent exposure, but they are not definitive. Thiocyanate can also come from diet and smoking. Its interpretation requires careful calibration against expected background, timing, and clinical context. To capture both free and bound cyanide, labs use total cyanide methods that begin with distillation or microdiffusion. The sample is first made alkaline to keep any cyanide from escaping, then acidified and distilled. The released HCN is trapped in a receiving solution and reacted with color reagents. The resulting color intensity, measured spectrophotometrically, yields a number a chemist can testify to. Later, high-performance liquid chromatography, HPLC, and ion chromatography allowed for direct separation and quantification of cyanide and thiocyanate without distillation's pitfalls. Enzymatic methods and electrochemical detectors added to the toolbox. Today, a good lab usually uses more than one method to cross-check its conclusions. Even with these advances, numbers must be read in light of biology. There is no single universal fatal blood cyanide concentration. Textbook ranges around 0.5 mg/L on the low end, several mg/L on the high end, depend on many factors: the victim's health, whether they had already been deprived of oxygen, whether CPR was attempted, how long before the sample was drawn, and more. Cyanide's fatal trick, again, is to shut down cytochrome C oxidase and halt aerobic respiration. The clinical echo is a striking lactic acidosis. In ERs worldwide, an inexplicably high lactate, often above 10 mmol/L in a smoke inhalation victim, is a whisper experienced clinicians learn to hear. It doesn't prove cyanide, but it makes a strong case for acting fast. The famous bitter almond note, so beloved in crime novels, is a weak read for real cases. Only a portion of people can detect it at all, and any odor that might have been noticed at the scene usually dissipates long before investigators arrive. Relying on smell isn't just unscientific, it's dangerous. Courtrooms have pushed forensic chemistry to grow up fast. Defense attorneys frequently probe cyanide findings. Was there contamination? Was the method validated? Were storage conditions adequate? Did post-mortem changes skew the results? These are not merely legal tactics, they're tied to real scientific concerns. Legal standards like the Fry test, 1923, which required general acceptance in the scientific community, and the later Daubert standard, 1993, which tasked judges with evaluating the relevance and reliability of expert methods, placed a heavy burden on crime labs. Validation, quality control, known error rates. These became not just lab ideals, but legal necessities. Some high-profile cases crystallized these issues. In product tampering and mass poisoning investigations, cyanide findings in capsules, food, and blood became decisive. The 1982 Tylenol case pushed labs to tighten their chain of custody procedures and to demonstrate that cyanide detected in products and in victims matched in context and could not be dismissed as background. In other prosecutions, the absence of clear cyanide evidence raised its own problems. Bodies cremated, autopsies refused, containers tossed into rivers. Courts sometimes convicted on circumstantial evidence access to cyanide, witness accounts of capsules or smells, clinical signs observed by first responders. These judgments sit uneasily with many forensic pathologists who would prefer chemical certainty. The result has been a culture of redundancy and caution. Modern labs often combine headspace GC-MS for free HCN, chromatographic methods for ionic species, and rapid color tests for screening. They stabilize samples, immediately raising blood pH to prevent loss, freezing tissues using sealed vials. In court, experts are expected not only to present numbers, but to explain metabolism, sampling limits, and uncertainties. Cyanide, as courtroom evidence, is vivid but always open to challenge. It rarely allows for the simple statement, "poison was present." Instead, it requires a story woven from peaks on a graph, plausible timelines, and corroborating facts. If the deathbed and the lab are cyanide's two technical theaters, medicine is its third. Here, science has largely been improvising under pressure. Some of the oldest emergency responses to cyanide poisoning predate our molecular understanding. Amyl nitrite, a volatile vasodilator in little glass ampoules, was used in battlefield and emergency settings long before its mechanism was widely understood. Inhaled amyl nitrite oxidizes some hemoglobin to methemoglobin, whose ion is in the ferric state. Methemoglobin cannot carry oxygen, but it can bind cyanide. In this context, methemoglobin acts as a decoy. By pulling cyanide away from mitochondrial enzymes, it allows respiration to resume. The trade-off is serious. Methemoglobinemia itself limits oxygen delivery. It is a dangerous balance, justifiable only when cyanide threatens to stop everything within minutes. From field improvisation grew structured antidote kits. Amyl nitrite in the field, followed by intravenous sodium nitrite in the hospital to sustain methemoglobinemia, plus sodium thiosulfate as a sulfur donor. Thiosulfate feeds the body's rhodonase pathway, speeding up conversion of cyanide to thiocyanate, which is then excreted. This combination, nitrite to trap, thiosulfate to detoxify, formed the backbone of cyanide treatment for much of the 20th century. It was clever biochemistry and saved many lives. But every antidote has its limits. Generating methemoglobin is risky in someone already in respiratory distress, especially in victims of smoke inhalation who may also be suffering from carbon monoxide poisoning. Infants, anemic patients, and those with G6PD deficiency are particularly vulnerable. And in massive exposures, when huge amounts of cyanide have already bound to essential enzymes, even the nitrite thiosulfate combo may come too late. Other agents were tried. Decobalt editate, a cobalt compound that forms a stable complex with cyanide, emerged as a powerful but hazardous therapy. It can provoke dangerous side effects and is reserved for dire emergencies. Then, starting in the late 20th century, hydroxycobalamin AA form of vitamin B12 rose to prominence. Hydroxycobalamin binds cyanide to form cyanocobalamin, another form of B12, which is physiologically harmless and excreted in urine. It doesn't depend on methemoglobin and doesn't worsen oxygen delivery. French clinicians, especially those treating smoke inhalation from fires, where cyanide from burning plastics complicates carbon monoxide poisoning, used it for years with good results. In the 2000s, the US FDA approved a commercial hydroxycobalamin kit. Fire departments, paramedics, and emergency rooms added it to their protocols. Hydroxycobalamin isn't magic. It requires IV access and relatively large doses, can transiently raise blood pressure, and dramatically reddens skin and urine, confusing some lab tests. And, as with any antidote, beyond a certain delay or dosage of cyanide, it will not reverse established brain death. Still, clinical guidelines developed into practical algorithms. In suspected cyanide poisoning industrial accidents, smoke inhalation, deliberate ingestion, or certain terror scenarios, airway and ventilation come first. If the history and physical findings point strongly towards cyanide severe lactic acidosis, cardiovascular collapse, cherry red skin, smoke exposure, antidotes are given empirically, often before confirmatory lab data are available. In mass casualty events where labs are overwhelmed and people are dying quickly, that empiricism becomes a moral obligation. The timing of treatment frequently means the difference between complete recovery and irreversible damage. This same tension, speed versus certainty, benefit versus risk, appears again when cyanide escapes industrial systems and rushes into ecosystems. The Bayer Mare spill at the end of January 2000 is often cited as a turning point. When a tailings dam at a Romanian gold processing plant failed, An estimated 100,000 cubic meters of cyanide and metal-laden slurry poured into the Sasar River, then into the Somesh, then the Tisza, and finally the Danube. Fish died by the millions. The water took on a strange sheen. Communities along 3 countries watched a river they had known for generations turn lethal. The geography mattered. The Tisza flows through Romania, Hungary, and Serbia. The Danube is Central and Southeastern Europe's great artery. When this toxic plume crossed national borders, it exposed the weakness of existing transboundary water agreements. Hungary, outraged and downstream, mobilized emergency measures and demanded accountability. Environmental groups and citizens voiced anger not just at one company's negligence, but at an entire model of mining that could still, after decades of supposed progress, produce such devastation. Biomera galvanized debates over cyanide leaching, the method that relies on cyanide's affinity for gold. Should this process continue? Could it be made safe enough? Or were some deposits simply not worth the risk? The political fallout was real. Lawsuits and compensation claims flew. Investigations mapped the damage. Industry faced a crisis of legitimacy. Within a few years, mining companies, international bodies, and some governments collaborated on a new framework, the International Cyanide Management Code. Developed in the early 2000s under the encouragement of the UN Environment Programme and industry associations, the code was not a law but functioned as one within certain sectors. Voluntary, performance-based, it set standards for the manufacture, transport, storage, use and disposal of cyanide in gold mining. Companies agreeing to the code submitted to independent audits and public reporting. Its logic was modern: rely on transparency and market pressure instead of criminal law. It required practical changes: safer transport, secure storage, emergency plans, worker training, lined tailings ponds, multiple containment barriers, wildlife protections, ongoing monitoring. It also demanded third-party verification and some degree of community engagement. Mines that adopted the code upgraded dams, installed better leak detection, and in some cases added on-site cyanide destruction processes, chemical oxidation, the INCO SO2 air process, and others to neutralize tailings before discharge. Investors and insurers started treating code compliance as a prerequisite for financing. In certain regions, the market began to reward good behavior. But voluntary standards have obvious limits. They attract companies already inclined toward compliance. They are weakest where governments are weak and profits tempt shortcuts. Audits depend on honest data. Not all auditors are equally independent. Some countries went further and tightened their own laws, especially those stung by recent spills. Hungary, shaken by Biomare, enacted stricter regulations, and later, broad public opposition helped block projects like the proposed Roșia Montana gold mine, where cyanide use was a central controversy. Elsewhere, governments introduced tougher hazardous transport rules, improved dam design requirements, and mandated environmental insurance. Yet a deeper problem lurked under the paperwork. Cyanide's chemistry resists simplification. Regulations that focus on free cyanide might overlook complex forms that can later release CN under changing conditions. Monitoring wells can miss leaks that travel along unexpected geological paths. Reports can be massaged. The political economy of gold complicates everything. In many poorer regions, mining is one of the few substantial employers. Promises of jobs and infrastructure weigh heavily. The code tried to shift the risk calculus by making poor practice expensive in reputational terms. But for some policymakers and communities facing immediate economic need, that reputational cost still competed with shorter-term gains. Community acceptance or rejection of cyanide mining, the so-called social license to operate, had to be negotiated again and again. In some places, the memory of spills and past abuses was strong enough to stop projects. In others, promises of wealth drowned out caution. On top of all this, cyanide accrued a rich cultural meaning. It became a symbol in books and movies. The fast, unseen killer, The Spies capsule, the aristocratic poison. The bitter almond trope persisted, even as toxicologists rolled their eyes. Fiction borrowed from history and then fed back into public perception. British and American spy novels of the mid-20th century used cyanide as a shorthand for high-stakes intrigue. Film noir, with its smoky glamour, made cyanide into a melancholic accessory, a way for doomed characters to choose their exit. More disturbing was cyanide's role in political assassinations and disappearances. Its small dose and rapid action appealed to secret police and covert units. Some deaths were staged as natural, others as mysterious sudden illnesses. Not every case can be clearly documented, but enough evidence exists to show that cyanide, in capsules or in more complex delivery systems, was sometimes part of campaigns against dissidents and perceived traitors. Above all, the shadow of Zyklon B, used in the gas chambers of Nazi camps, gave cyanide an indelible association with state murder. The technical language of delousing and fumigation had been twisted into a vocabulary of genocide. Since then, any conversation about cyanide carries that historical weight. It shapes public reaction to proposals for new cyanide plants, mines, or large-scale uses. Popular depictions rarely get all the toxicology right. On screen, cyanide kills in seconds. In real life, timing varies with dose, route, and a person's condition. Antidotes exist. Some victims suffer agonizing minutes or hours and survive with neurological damage. Others succumb too quickly for help. Historians and toxicologists often find themselves pushing back, reminding people that cyanide's story is probabilistic, not theatrical. Yet, as the protests in Romania around Roșia Montana showed crowds carrying signs reading, "Water not gold, symbols matter," cyanide is no longer just a reagent. It is a shorthand for the trade-off between profit and the commons. From there, the story circles back to regulation, to culture, to memory. Regulators, often invisible figures with spreadsheets and risk maps, step into quiet nights to count what can go wrong. The first attempts to govern cyanide in mining were usually national, permitting discharge limits, worker safety rules. Baia Mare marked the moment when cyanide policy became plainly international. A spill that passes from one country's river to another's drinking water forces diplomacy. Early meetings after Baia Mare long tables, simultaneous translation. Negotiators from ministries, NGOs, the World Bank, and mining multinationals replayed an old drama. Engineers and executives argued in the language of ore grades and process efficiency. Environmental scientists and community representatives countered with the language of ecosystems and human rights. Both sides spoke of risk, but they meant different things and had different tolerances for uncertainty. The International Cyanide Management Code was the compromise. Not a treaty, but a standard. Not legally binding, but economically meaningful. It required companies to bring their private calculations about spill probabilities and cleanup costs out into daylight, where investors, regulators, and communities could at least see them, if not always trust them. Its impact has been tangible in some places. Better infrastructure, better training, quicker reporting of incidents. It has also suffered from the classic weaknesses of self-regulation. Uneven adoption, occasional box ticking, the temptation to treat audits as PR exercises. Beyond the code, real progress has come from three overlapping forces: technological ingenuity, legal accountability, and public pressure. Engineers have refined cyanide destruction methods and monitoring technologies. Courts and insurers have raised the cost of negligence. And communities have learned to organize, to insist on being part of the conversation. At the same time, alternative chemistries, thiosulfate leaching, glycine-based systems, chloride processes have started to prove that in at least some contexts, cyanide is not the only viable option. Their spread is slow and uneven, but their existence changes the ethical equation. If safer methods can work, then the bar for cyanide use rises. Finally, memory and narrative play their part. Cyanide's long and tangled history, its role in art, agriculture, industry, war, suicide, murder, disaster. Forces us to ask who carries the burden when things go wrong and how those burdens are remembered. The fishermen who saw their river turn black, the families who lost relatives to tainted medicine, the workers who stood over open tanks day after day, the victims who never had the chance to know what they were ingesting. Their stories are often harder to tell than the dramatized tales of spies and tyrants. They lack glamour, but they are the ground truth on which regulations, codes, and technical fixes either stand or fail. Cyanide will not vanish from industrial chemistry anytime soon. But its biography teaches a pattern. Science reveals possibilities, industry scales them. Tragedy or outrage provokes rules. Technology adapts, culture keeps score. At every turn, there is room, if not always the will for human choices, to tilt the balance away from harm. When you think of cyanide late at night, when history and horror stories tend to blur together, picture not just the capsule and the crime novel glass, but the chain behind every gram. Picture engineers calculating dam walls, truck drivers learning hazardous cargo procedures, auditors poring over logbooks, villagers remembering the day fish floated to the surface like silver trash. Picture protesters holding signs that say, simply and stubbornly, "Water over gold." Picture researchers in small labs coaxing microbes to eat cyanide, turning a deadly ion into something harmless. History rarely sleeps soundly. It shifts between carelessness and reform. But cyanide's history, stretching from a blue in a Berlin vat to courtrooms and riverbanks, suggests that even very dangerous technologies can be pushed, with enough pressure, toward more careful use. It also leaves us with a quiet, demanding thought. Technology is never just neutral hardware. It becomes what we let it become. Cyanide's future, like the future of other tools that tie wealth to risk, will be shaped not only by profit margins, but by the slow, steady work of people insisting that their rivers, their air, and their shared safety matter at least as much as any metal pulled from stone. Regulators are not romantic figures. They tend to arrive not with sirens, but with clipboards. Not with raids, but with forms. The story of cyanide's regulation really begins with that kind of arrival, not the dramatic knock of armed police, but the slow, inevitable appearance of paperwork, committees, risk matrices spread across tables. When enough accidents had piled up, when enough rivers had been asked to carry the blame, governments, industry, and a chorus of anxious citizens began to imagine a world in which one particular chemical, a reagent, used to strip metal from rock, might be governed more tightly, restrained, and made somewhat predictable. The inflection point that most people point to lies cold on the map of Central Europe. On January 30th, 2000, a tailings dam at the Oral gold processing plant near Baia Mare, Romania, failed. Tons of cyanide-bearing slurry poured into nearby streams, a dark, shimmering stain moving with slow violence down the Sasar into the Somesh, then into the Tisza, and finally into the Danube. For weeks, news images showed dead fish floating belly up like discarded coins, and fishing communities shocked into silence. The spill crossed borders, making it impossible to pretend this was just one country's internal problem. Hungary, downstream and furious, watched its own waterways poisoned and its own citizens enraged. The international gaze snapped onto something many had previously filed away as a local issue, that a single plant's failure could foul a shared European river system. Baia Mare was not the first such incident. It was simply the one that condensed scattered worries into political pressure. Throughout the 1990s and before, smaller spills, leaks, and workplace exposures were usually treated as business risks, things to be minimized, occasionally reported, and quietly settled. Companies bought insurance. Governments weighed fines against tax revenue. Towns accepted jobs in exchange for living near hazard. But when that cyanide-laced plume crossed 3 national boundaries, it reframed cyanide from a private industrial issue to an international one. In the early meetings that followed, the scene was as procedural as any bureaucratic drama. Long horseshoe tables, translators at the back, delegations from mining ministries, environment agencies, NGOs, development banks, and multinational mining firms. Old tensions reappeared in new language. One side spoke in terms of metallurgical efficiency, ore grades, and economics. The other spoke about aquatic ecosystems, indigenous rights, and the irreversible loss of livelihoods. Both sides discussed risk, but one's acceptable risk was the other's catastrophe. From that friction came something that was neither a law nor merely a brochure: the International Cyanide Management Code for the manufacture, transport, and use of cyanide in the production of gold. Released in the early 2000s, it functioned as a voluntary, performance-based standard administered by a multi-stakeholder body. It was not ratified by parliaments, but it behaved like quasi-law in financing and insurance. The code demanded concrete steps. It required safer transport protocols, secure storage, robust emergency response plans, worker training, monitoring and reporting of cyanide in process water and tailings, engineered tailings facilities with liners and conservative design margins, wildlife protection around ponds, and periodic independent audits. It required that companies publish audit summaries and engage with nearby communities. In effect, the code tried to drag risk calculations out of private spreadsheets and onto the public record, so that investors, banks, regulators, and neighbors could at least see how companies were thinking about spills and failures. That visibility had real consequences. Mines seeking international investment or insurance had to show code compliance. Tailings ponds were redesigned with thicker liners and multiple barriers. Single aging pipelines over unstable terrain gave way to redundant systems with leak detection. Cyanide destruction circuits were added at some sites, using processes like alkaline chlorination or the Inco SO2 DAO's air method to break down cyanide in tailings before discharge. Emergency planning matured from a few phone numbers on a wall to coordinated drills with hospitals, fire brigades, and water authorities. Some companies moved from open, wildlife-accessible ponds to more controlled treatment systems. But the code's voluntary nature was also its main flaw. It attracted the already willing. In jurisdictions with weak enforcement and strong corruption, some operators simply ignored it or treated it as public relations. Audits are only as good as the data they receive and the independence of the auditor. As with financial accounting, the audit industry around cyanide management formed its own ecosystem, with its own incentives and, at times, its own blind spots. A second, more subtle limit of the regulatory turn was epistemic. Cyanide is easy to measure in some forms and hard in others. Regulators like clean numbers, parts per million of free cyanide. But cyanide exists in multiple forms: free, weakly complexed, strongly bound, and can be transformed by pH, sunlight, and microbial action. A rule focused solely on free cyanide could miss complex forms that might later release CN as conditions change. Geology also misbehaves. Tailings ponds that look secure in design documents can leak through fractures, faults, and layers no one expected. Regulations can require monitoring wells. Monitoring results can be selectively interpreted. The neatness of regulation trails behind the messiness of chemistry and earth. Then there is politics. In many countries, gold is not just a commodity, it is part of national development plans, patronage networks, and balance sheets. Mining firms argued, often correctly, that without cyanide, certain low-grade deposits could not be profitably mined. Governments in resource-dependent regions, keen for foreign investment and jobs, were inclined to permit operations that used cyanide, provided they promised jobs and infrastructure. The code tried to upgrade that bargain by adding reputational cost to bad practice. But in towns where mining is the only substantial employer, reputational damage can feel abstract compared with immediate wages. Social license, the ongoing consent of local communities, remained uneven, contested, and fragile. Amid all this, cyanide gathered symbolic weight in public culture. It was no longer just a reagent. It was the stuff in the gas chambers, the poison in the Spies' tooth, the thing that killed fish by the ton. Activists and local communities drew on that symbolism in protests and campaigns. The Roșia Montana project in Romania, proposed by a Canadian company, became a visible battleground in the 2000s and early 2010s. The plan called for a massive open-pit gold mine using cyanide leaching in a historically and environmentally sensitive area. Thousands marched in Bucharest and other cities, carrying signs that boiled the debate down to a clear moral equation: water, not gold. They invoked Baia Mare, cyanide spills elsewhere, and the broader history of extractive industries leaving behind polluted landscapes. Ultimately, political and social resistance stalled the project. Even in a world of voluntary codes and technical assurances, collective memory and public symbolism still had the power to shape outcomes. All of this forces us back to some basic ethical questions. When a river is poisoned, who is responsible? Who pays for cleanup and for how long? Who gets to decide whether a cyanide-based project goes forward? National officials, local residents, shareholders, or some combination? Who counts as a stakeholder when a company from one country mines in another, using a shared river that flows into a third? These are not just legal puzzles, they are moral ones. They're about how we distribute risk and benefit across geography, time, and social class. Practical lessons start with transparency and participation. Technical solutions alone, thicker liners, better valves, do not guarantee justice. Communities living near cyanide operations must be genuinely informed and able to influence decisions, not just handed glossy assurances. The Cyanide Code, for all its shortcomings, did at least introduce a model of third-party verification and public reporting into an industry that had often preferred opacity. Public audit summaries gave local groups something to point to or to challenge. That matters. It arms people with a vocabulary and with documents, making it harder for corporations to hide behind vague claims. Technological innovation offers additional hope. Chemical processes like the INCO SO2R air method, hydrogen peroxide oxidation, and newer approaches can significantly reduce cyanide in tailings. Bioremediation using microbes and plants that can metabolize cyanide has moved from theory to practice at some sites. Continuous monitoring with sensors and remote systems makes it harder to ignore leaks or spikes. Satellite imagery and drones can spot subtle changes in tailings, ponds and streams. Alternatives to cyanide in gold extraction, thiosulfate leaching, glycine systems, chloride-based processes are still maturing, but they prove that cyanide or nothing is not always the reality. Where viable alternatives exist, the ethical threshold for using cyanide rises. At the same time, laws and institutions must evolve. Regulators need adequate funding and insulation from political interference. Long-term liability mechanisms, bonds, insurance pools, environmental trust funds, must be sized to actual cleanup costs, not just to what is politically easy in the short term. International law must keep strengthening cooperation on shared rivers, so downstream nations are not left begging after upstream accidents. International finance institutions can push things in the right direction by making strong environmental safeguards and community consent a non-negotiable condition for loans. Memory matters too. Cyanide accidents and abuses are easy to forget once the fish rot away and the water clears, especially for those not directly affected. Memorials, community museums, oral history projects, and long-term health studies keep experiences from slipping into footnotes. They also help ensure that the human and ecological costs of cheap gold or efficient fumigation show up in our mental accounting. Cyanide will likely remain an indispensable hazard in certain industries for the foreseeable future. But its story shows a repeating pattern. Technological possibility, industrial scale-up, disaster or scandal, regulation, adaptation, and cultural response. At every step, human decisions can nudge that pattern towards smaller harms and better protections, or toward repetition of old mistakes. In the end, cyanide is a compact lesson in how modern life negotiates the relationship between profit and the commons, between secrecy and accountability, between quick solutions and long consequences. It reminds us that even a molecule discovered through an accident of color can grow into a thread woven through art, agriculture, war, medicine, crime, law, and environmental politics. And it leaves us with one last quiet kind of hope. If a substance with such a dark resume can be partially tamed, its dangers mapped, its use constrained, its victims remembered, then other risky technologies might be steered too. Not toward sainthood, chemicals do not become good, but toward a world in which we at least know what we're doing, who we're endangering, and what we owe them in return. Cyanide's history does not promise redemption. It offers something more modest and more realistic. Vigilance, humility, and a reminder that beautiful colors, efficient processes, and neat scientific solutions always carry shadows, and that it is up